You are nothing. Take your pup and get out of my house. The story opens with the brutal, quiet erasure of a life, not screamed but spoken, which makes it worse. The devastation is framed against the contrast of warm penthouse light behind Ji-hoon and cold soul rain ahead of him. We meet Lee Ji-hoon at his absolute lowest, unmated, cast out, 9 months pregnant, standing on wet pavement with nothing but a cracked phone and a child his alpha just called unwanted. The stakes are immediate and biological, an Omega's survival and a child's first breath. The scene then pivots from despair to dark intrigue when Ji-hoon's desperate message lands on the wrong number. A private, untraceable line belonging to Seo Hyun-woo, the most feared man in Seoul. The hook is not the eviction. It is the silence before Hyun-woo reaches for his coat. Before I tell you what happens next, subscribe to Starry-Eyed Lovers, and tell me where you're watching from. The bench was the worst place to wait for nothing. Ji-hoon had not chosen it deliberately. His legs had simply stopped working somewhere between the Han River railing and the far end of the park path, and the bench had been there, so he had sat. That was 20 minutes ago. Or an hour. He had stopped checking his phone because every time the screen lit up, it wasn't the contact he had messaged, and the battery was at 11%, and he could not afford to watch it die. The rain had thinned to a mist that didn't feel like rain until you'd been sitting in it long enough to realize you were soaked. His red dress, the one he had worn to dinner 3 nights ago when he still believed things could be repaired, clung to his arms and his back and stretched across his belly in a way that felt indecent now, exposed, like wearing evidence of everything that had gone wrong. He pressed both hands to his stomach and felt the baby shift, a slow rolling movement, unhurried, unbothered, alive in a way that made his throat close. I know, he thought. I know. I'm sorry. He heard the car before he saw it. Not because it was loud, it wasn't. A black vehicle, long and low and moving without urgency, rolling to a stop along the park road with the quiet confidence of something that has never needed to announce itself. The headlights cut through the mist, and then went dark. A door opened. Closed. Footsteps on wet pavement. Ji-hoon looked up. The man walking toward him was tall. Not in the way that made people look thin, but in the way that made the space around him feel smaller. He wore a dark coat, collar up against the rain he seemed entirely unbothered by, and his hands were in his pockets with the ease of someone who had never once in his life been in a hurry, because the world had always waited for him. He stopped a few feet away. Just looked. Ji-hoon's first instinct was to stand. His body refused. You sent the message, the man said. It was not a question. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that didn't need volume because it had never needed to compete with anything. Ji-hoon stared at him. At the ink climbing his neck from beneath the collar. At the absolute stillness of his face. Ji-hoon stopped. Swallowed. I think I sent it to the wrong number. You did. A silence opened up between them, wide and strange. The mist kept falling. Somewhere on the river, a boat horn sounded and faded. Then why are you here? Ji-hoon asked. The man looked at him for a moment. Not at his belly, not at the ruined dress, not at the obvious disaster of him sitting alone on a park bench in the rain at this hour. At his face, as if that was the only relevant information. Because you asked for help, he said. And no one else came. Ji-hoon felt something crack open in his chest, and immediately pressed it closed. He could not afford that. Not here. Not in front of a stranger whose name he didn't know, and whose car probably cost more than the apartment he had just been thrown out of. I don't know you, Ji-hoon said carefully. No. I can't just, he gestured vaguely at the car, at the night, at the impossible arithmetic of the situation. I can't get into a car with someone I don't know. The man tilted his head slightly, the way a person does when they are being patient with something they find mildly unreasonable. You're 9 months pregnant. You've been sitting in the rain for over an hour. Your phone is about to die. He paused. What exactly is the alternative? Ji-hoon opened his mouth. Closed it. There wasn't one. That was the honest answer, and they both knew it, and the knowing of it sat in Ji-hoon's stomach alongside the weight of the baby and the specific humiliation of being 28 years old and having arrived at a park bench as the last resort. What's your name? Ji-hoon asked. Another pause. Shorter this time. Seo Hyun-woo. It meant nothing to Ji-hoon. He filed it away anyway. Lee Ji-hoon, he said. I know. That should have frightened him. It did a quick cold thing that moved through him and was gone. But Hyun-woo had already turned and taken 2 steps back toward the car. Not commanding, not dragging, just moving with the assumption that the reasonable conclusion had been reached and there was no reason to stand in the rain any longer than necessary. He opened the rear door and waited. Ji-hoon looked at the bench. At the river. At the 11% battery and the 0 unread messages, and the rain that had no opinion about any of it. He stood up slowly, one hand on his belly, and walked to the car. The interior was warm in the immediate, enveloping way of expensive things. Heated seats, silence so complete it felt pressurized, the faint smell of cedar and something colder underneath. Jihoon sat, and the door closed and Hyunwoo was on the other side of the back seat with the same stillness he'd had outside, as if he occupied space differently from other people, without leaking into it. The car moved. Jihoon watched the park disappear through the rain-blurred window. He pressed his lips together and breathed through his nose and absolutely did not cry, because he had decided that in the car of a stranger whose name he had been given once was not the place. "Where are you taking me?" he asked. "Somewhere dry," Hyunwoo said. He was looking ahead. "Somewhere safe. That's not an address." "No," Hyunwoo agreed. "It's not." Jihoon looked at him then, really looked, the way you look at something when you're trying to determine whether it is dangerous or whether it only looks dangerous, and found that he could not tell. The tattoos on his neck disappeared into his collar. His jaw was sharp and set. He did not look like a man who explained himself. "Why?" Jihoon asked quietly. "You don't know me either." Hyunwoo was quiet for long enough that Jihoon thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, without turning his head, "I know enough." The car moved through Seoul like it was invisible, through intersections that seemed to clear ahead of it, past lights that somehow always turned in their favor. Jihoon held his belly with both hands and watched the city slide by outside the glass. All that light, all those lives continuing without interruption, and tried to understand what had just happened to him. He had sent a message to the wrong number. And the wrong number had come. The penthouse did not look like a place where dangerous things happened. That was the first thing Jihoon noticed, and then immediately distrusted. It was the kind of space that had been designed to make a person feel small without making them feel threatened, floor-to-ceiling glass on three sides, Seoul spread out below like a map of itself, all light and distance, and the suggestion that everything down there was manageable from up here. The furniture was dark and minimal. No clutter. No softness except for one low couch the color of charcoal that looked like it cost more than most people's cars. Everything in its place. Everything deliberate. It felt, Jihoon thought, exactly like its owner. A woman had met them at the elevator, 50s, precise, with the specific kind of composure that came from decades of being unshockable. She had looked at Jihoon once, taken in the soaked dress and the belly and the state of him, and then looked at Hyunwoo. "Guest room," Hyunwoo said. That was all. She had nodded and led Jihoon down a hallway without another word, as if heavily pregnant strangers arrived at this hour regularly, and the only variable was which room. The guest room was larger than the apartment Jihoon had lived in before the bond. The bed was white and enormous, and when he finally sat on it, after the woman, Mrs. Yoon, she said, just Mrs. Yoon, had left a folded set of dry clothes on the chair and closed the door softly behind her, he sat there for a full minute doing nothing. Just existing in the warmth. Just breathing air that wasn't rain. Then he changed slowly, carefully, and lay down, and was unconscious within 4 minutes. He woke to pale morning light and the particular silence of a place that was never loud to begin with. For a disoriented moment, he didn't know where he was. And then the baby moved and gravity returned, and he remembered everything in the correct order, like a file reopening. He found the kitchen by following the smell of coffee. Hyunwoo was already there, standing at the counter with a cup, still in dark clothing, looking out at the city the way a person looks at something they own. He didn't turn around when Jihoon entered, but he spoke. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I deserved to," Jihoon said, and then wondered why he'd said it like that, like an apology. Hyunwoo turned then. He looked at Jihoon the same way he had in the park. Direct, unhurried, taking inventory without being obvious about it. "Sit down," he said. "Mrs. Yoon will bring food." "I don't need. You're 9 months pregnant, and you didn't eat last night." His voice carried no heat. Just the flat geometry of a fact. "Sit down." Jihoon sat down. The food came, rice, soup, things that were warm and simple, and arrived in the exact quantities that suggested someone had thought about it. Jihoon ate with the focused efficiency of a person whose body had overruled their pride, and tried not to think about how strange it was to be sitting in a stranger's kitchen being fed like he was expected. "I need to make some calls today," Jihoon said, when the soup was half gone. "I have a friend in Mapo. I can probably." "Your friend moved to Busan 4 months ago," Hyunwoo said, without looking up from his phone. "The number you tried last night before you sent the message to me. That's who you were trying to reach." Jihoon went still. Hyunwoo set his phone down. "I'm not telling you to stay. I'm telling you that the option you were planning doesn't exist." "How do you know where my friend moved?" A pause. Brief but deliberate. "I looked." "You looked?" Ji-hoon repeated slowly. In the what? The 4 hours since last night, you looked into my contacts and found out where someone I know moved to. Yes. The word landed without apology, without softening. Ji-hoon stared at him and felt the shape of the situation shift slightly. The way a room looks different when you realize there's a door in it you hadn't noticed. This was not a man who had responded to a wrong number out of ordinary kindness. This was a man who, within hours of receiving a single text message, had already begun to know things. Who are you? Ji-hoon asked. Not the name. He had the name. What do you actually do? Hyunwoo looked at him for a moment. Then he stood, carried his cup to the counter, and said, Finish eating. Ji-hoon did not finish eating. Tell me. Something crossed Hyunwoo's face that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite irritation. It was the expression of a man who was not accustomed to being held in place by a question. He turned around and leaned against the counter with his arms folded and looked at Ji-hoon with that same absolute steadiness. I run things, he said. What things? The kind that don't get discussed over breakfast. Ji-hoon held his gaze. Outside, Seoul had woken up completely, the city going about its enormous indifferent business 60 floors below, and up here it was just the two of them and a silence that had weight to it. I'm staying in your home, Ji-hoon said quietly. I think I have a right to know what kind of home it is. Hyunwoo studied him. Then he unfolded his arms and walked back to the table and sat down across from Ji-hoon, which was not what Ji-hoon had expected him to do, and for a moment said nothing. There are people in this city who make decisions, he said finally. About money. About territory. About what happens when someone causes a problem that the law either can't or won't solve. He paused. I'm the person those people call. Ji-hoon absorbed this. So when you say you run things, I mean that most of what moves through this city moves because I allow it to. The silence after that was different from the ones before it. Ji-hoon looked down at his hands on the table and then back up. And you brought me here. Yes. Why? Hyunwoo's jaw tightened. It was the smallest movement, barely visible. But Ji-hoon caught it, because he had spent 3 years learning to read the faces of men who didn't want to be read. Because you needed somewhere to go, Hyunwoo said. And I have somewhere. It wasn't the whole answer. Ji-hoon was certain of that. But it was the answer he was going to get, and he understood, sitting in the enormous bright kitchen of a man who apparently controlled the architecture of this city's underworld, that pressing further right now was not the right move. He picked up his spoon and finished the soup. Later that afternoon, he stood at the floor-to-ceiling window and watched a convoy of 3 black vehicles pull into the building's underground entrance 60 floors below. Within minutes, his phone, charged now, courtesy of a cable Mrs. Yoon had produced without being asked, showed a news alert. A city councilor had just withdrawn a major development vote. No reason given. Ji-hoon looked toward the hallway where he could hear Hyunwoo's voice, low and unhurried, on a call. He thought about the word somewhere. The deliberate vagueness of it. The way Hyunwoo had said I allow it with the same tone another man might say I prefer it. Like power was just weather, just the condition of existing. The baby pressed against his ribs, steady and insistent. I know, Ji-hoon thought again. I know exactly where we are. The file arrived on Hyunwoo's desk on the 3rd morning. Ji-hoon didn't know about it. He was in the guest room at the time, sitting cross-legged on the bed with his phone in his lap, reading a legal notice that had been forwarded to his last known email address by a firm he had never heard of. The language was clean and precise and designed to be both perfectly clear and perfectly devastating. Park Seo-jin, his former alpha, his former bond partner, the man who had put him on the street 3 nights ago, was filing to terminate Ji-hoon's parental rights on the grounds of abandonment and emotional instability. The child, the document stated, would be better served in a stable, 2-parent household. Ji-hoon read it twice. Then he set the phone face down on the mattress and sat very still with both hands on his belly and breathed through his nose until the walls stopped feeling like they were moving. Then he picked the phone back up and read it a 3rd time, because he needed to be certain he understood exactly what was being done to him. He was certain by the 4th line. He kept reading anyway. Hyunwoo read the file the way he read everything, without visible reaction, from beginning to end, in the specific silence of a man who has trained himself to receive information before he decides what to do with it. The document his associate had placed on the desk was 43 pages. Financial records. Photographs. A timeline assembled with the kind of thoroughness that only came from either obsession or resources. And in this case it was clearly both. Park Seo-jin, 41. Senior partner at one of Seoul's most connected corporate law firms. A man whose name appeared in the footnotes of 3 government infrastructure deals and whose photograph had appeared twice in the society pages beside a woman who was not Lee Ji-hoon. The bond with Ji-hoon had been registered 2 years and 8 months ago. Quietly. No announcement, no celebration. The kind of bond that had been useful to one party and everything to the other. Hyun-woo turned a page. The hospital records were in the middle of the file. He read those twice. When he finished, he closed the folder. He placed both hands flat on the desk and looked at the wall for a moment, and then he said, very quietly, to the man standing near the door, "Get me everything on his firm. Every client, every case, every account that touches anything of mine or adjacent to mine." He paused. "And find out who filed that custody notice this morning." The man left without a word. Hyun-woo sat back and looked at the closed folder and felt something he rarely permitted himself. Something that ran beneath the cold, architectural logic he used for everything, deeper than strategy, older than calculation. It was not anger exactly. Anger was loud and inefficient. This was quieter than that, and because it was quieter, it was considerably more dangerous. Ji-hoon found him in the study that evening. He hadn't planned to. He had spent the afternoon oscillating between lying on the bed staring at the ceiling and standing at the window watching the city with the unfocused intensity of someone trying to think through a problem that had no good solutions. He had drafted 2 messages to the law firm and deleted both. He had considered calling his mother and rejected it immediately. Eventually his body had demanded movement, and he had followed the light down the hallway. Hyun-woo was at his desk. He looked up when Ji-hoon appeared in the doorway and said nothing, which Ji-hoon had come to understand was an invitation. "He filed for custody," Ji-hoon said. "I know." Ji-hoon stepped into the room. "You know because you've been looking into me." "Yes." "Then you know everything." He said it flatly, without shame, because shame required energy he didn't currently have, and because there was something in Hyun-woo's stillness that made performance feel pointless. "The hospital visits." He stopped, pressed his lips together. "All of it." "Yes," Hyun-woo said again. His voice was exactly the same as it always was. Even. Unhurried. And yet something underneath it was different tonight. A current running below the surface that Ji-hoon could feel without being able to name. Ji-hoon crossed to the chair across from the desk and sat down heavily, one hand on his belly, and looked at the man across from him. "Then you understand what he's doing. It's not about the baby. He doesn't want a child. He's never wanted a child. He wants to make sure I have nothing. That I leave whatever this is." He gestured vaguely at the penthouse, at the air between them. "With nothing that belongs to me." Hyun-woo looked at him steadily. "He won't succeed. You don't know what he's capable of. His firm has 3 sitting judges on retainer. He destroyed a business partner's career in 4 months because the man owed him a debt and couldn't pay it. He is." Ji-hoon stopped himself, heard the escalation in his own voice, and pulled it back. "He is very good at this." "So am I," Hyun-woo said. The simplicity of it was almost startling. No elaboration. No reassurance dressed up in warmth. Just the flat statement of a fact, delivered by a man who had apparently never needed to convince anyone of his capabilities because the evidence had always preceded him. Ji-hoon looked at the desk. At the closed folder sitting at the edge of it. "Is that my file?" A pause. "Yes." "Can I ask what's in it that you didn't already know from reading about me?" Hyun-woo was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The hospital records from 14 months ago." Ji-hoon went very still. "The ones filed under a false name," Hyun-woo continued, his voice unchanged, giving nothing away except by the care with which he was giving nothing away. "At a private clinic in Gangnam. The ones that list the cause of the injury as a fall. The silence between them was different from all the ones before it. It had a texture to it." Ji-hoon kept his eyes on the desk and felt the familiar architecture of that particular memory. How he had constructed walls around it and doors that locked from the inside, and how he had lived in that construction so long it had started to feel like the truth. "It was not a fall," Hyun-woo said quietly. "No," Ji-hoon said. "It wasn't." Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Outside, the city continued at its enormous indifferent pace, all light and motion and total unconcern. Ji-hoon finally looked up and found Hyun-woo watching him with an expression he hadn't seen on his face before. Not pity, which Ji-hoon would have left the room for, but something far more controlled and far more frightening. The expression of a man who has received a piece of information and has already begun, quietly and without announcement, to decide what to do with it. "Don't," Ji-hoon said. Hyun-woo raised an eyebrow slightly. "Whatever you're thinking," Ji-hoon said. "Don't do it for me. I don't want to be the reason." "You're not the reason," Hyun-woo said. He picked up his phone from the desk and looked at it briefly, then set it back down. "He did this to himself the moment he put his hands on you." Ji-hoon opened his mouth. "Closed it. Get some sleep, Hyunwoo said, and his voice had returned to its usual register. Even quiet, a door that had closed again. You need to rest. Jihoon stood, walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame and said, without turning around, he has a lot of protection. I know, Hyunwoo said. He won't make it easy. I don't need it to be easy. Jihoon nodded once to the doorframe, to the hallway ahead of him, and walked back to his room. Behind him, he heard the soft sound of Hyunwoo picking up his phone, and then a voice, low, unhurried, absolute, beginning to speak. Before I tell you what happens next, subscribe to Starry-Eyed Lovers and tell me where you're watching from. It was the insomnia that did it. Jihoon had never slept well in the third trimester. The baby had opinions about position, about pressure, about the precise angle at which a human body was allowed to rest. But the penthouse at 2 in the morning had a particular quality of silence that made lying still feel like an instruction he couldn't follow. He had tried. He had rearranged the pillows 3 times, which was 2 more times than he was willing to admit, and eventually he had given up and pulled himself upright and sat at the edge of the bed in the dark, listening to a city that never fully went quiet. He found his way to the kitchen by memory now. For days and the layout had already settled into his body. Left out of the guest room, past the study, through the wide corridor where the city appeared in the windows like a painting of itself. He filled a glass with water and stood at the counter and drank it slowly and tried not to think about the legal notice, which meant he thought about nothing else. He almost didn't see Hyunwoo. He was sitting in the far corner of the living room, in the dark, in the chair that faced the window. No lamp, no phone, no drink. Just sitting, looking out at Seoul with the same quality of stillness he carried everywhere. Except that at 2 in the morning with no audience and no performance required, there was something different about it. Something that looked, Jihoon thought, almost like exhaustion. He hesitated in the kitchen doorway. I didn't know anyone was up. I don't sleep much, Hyunwoo said without turning around. Jihoon should have said good night and gone back to his room. Instead, he crossed the living room and sat down on the far end of the charcoal couch, angled toward the window, and looked out at the city alongside him. Neither of them spoke for a while. The silence was easier than it should have been between 2 people who were still, technically, strangers. How long have you had this place? Jihoon asked eventually, because the view at this hour demanded some kind of acknowledgement. 7 years. Do you ever get used to it? The view. Hyunwoo was quiet for a moment. No, he said. I don't think you're supposed to. Jihoon looked at the lights below. Thousands of windows, thousands of lives still burning at this hour, and felt something loosen slightly in his chest. Not safety exactly. Something adjacent to it. Can I ask you something? He said. You're going to regardless, Hyunwoo said, and there was something in his voice that in another register might have been dry humor. You said you know enough. That night in the park. Jihoon kept his eyes on the window. Enough about what? Enough to come, enough to bring me here, enough to... He stopped, searching for the right word. You said it like it was obvious. Like the decision had already been made. The pause that followed was longer than the others. Outside, a plane crossed the sky in a slow diagonal, its lights blinking red and white and then gone. I've seen you before, Hyunwoo said. Jihoon turned to look at him. Hyunwoo was still facing the window. His jaw was set in that familiar way, but there was something else beneath it tonight. Something that looked like a man choosing his words not for concealment, but for precision. There's a cafe in See a Demon. You went every Thursday morning for about 6 months. You always ordered the same thing, and you always sat at the corner table, and you always brought a book that you never actually read. Jihoon stared at him. How do you know that? Because I was there. He paused. Not every Thursday, but often enough. You were, Jihoon stopped. Restarted. That cafe is nowhere near anything I'd associate with. He gestured at the penthouse, at the implicit empire of it. Any of this. No, Hyunwoo agreed. It isn't. The implication settled over Jihoon slowly, the way cold does. Not all at once, but in increments, each one slightly more undeniable than the last. You went there because of me, he said. Hyunwoo said nothing, which was its own answer. Jihoon looked at his hands in his lap. At the city. Back at the man sitting 4 feet away from him in the dark. For how long? 7 months. 7, Jihoon exhaled slowly. And you never approached me. Never said anything. No. Why? Hyunwoo turned to look at him then, for the first time since the conversation had begun, and the city light fell across his face in a way that made him look less architectural, less like something built to withstand things, and more like a person who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was only now setting it down far enough to acknowledge its weight. Because you were bonded, he said. And because what I am is not something I would bring to someone who already had a life. Ji-hoon held his gaze and felt the sentence land in full. Not a declaration. Not a plea. Just the statement of a boundary that had been maintained, quietly and without recognition, for 7 months by a man who by all accounts had never needed to observe anyone else's boundaries in his life. He wasn't good to me, Ji-hoon said quietly. The bond. In case the file didn't. In case it wasn't clear. It was clear, Hyunwoo said, and something moved through his voice on those 3 words, something that came and went so quickly Ji-hoon might have missed it if he hadn't been watching. It was very clear. They sat in the dark for a while without speaking. Ji-hoon became aware of the space between them on the couch. Not large, maybe 2 feet, and the fact that he was not uncomfortable with it, which was itself information. He had spent 3 years learning to find presence threatening. This was different. This was the particular stillness of someone who took up exactly as much space as they needed, and not 1 inch more. I don't know what to do with this, Ji-hoon said eventually. Not an accusation. Just the truth. You don't have to do anything with it, Hyunwoo said. I'm not telling you because I want something. I'm telling you because you asked, and I don't lie by omission to people living in my home. Ji-hoon almost smiled. Almost. That's a very specific rule. I have very specific rules. What are the others? Hyunwoo looked at him for a long moment. You'll learn them, he said, and turned back to the window. Ji-hoon settled back against the couch cushions and looked out at Seoul, enormous and indifferent and blazing in the dark, and felt the baby shift against his ribs in that slow, rolling way that had come to feel like punctuation. Like the universe weighing in. He thought about 7 months of Thursdays. A man in a cafe he had no reason to visit, reading nothing, saying nothing, maintaining a distance that had cost him something. He thought about the park bench and the rain and the silence on the line before Hyunwoo had moved. He didn't say any of this. There was no version of it he could say cleanly, not yet, not here in the dark with 2 feet of couch between them and everything still so precarious and unresolved. But he didn't go back to his room either. He stayed until the city began to go gray at its edges, and Hyunwoo stayed too, and neither of them mentioned it in the morning. The appointment had been Mrs. Yoon's idea. Not the clinic itself. Hyunwoo had arranged that, a private obstetrics practice in Yongsan whose staff apparently understood discretion the way other people understood breathing. But the suggestion that Ji-hoon needed air first, needed to exist outside the penthouse for an hour before the appointment, needed something that resembled a normal morning. Mrs. Yoon had said it the way she said most things, which was without inflection and without room for debate, and Ji-hoon had found himself nodding before he'd finished processing the sentence. Hyunwoo had not liked it. He hadn't said so directly. Ji-hoon was learning that Hyunwoo rarely said the thing directly when the shape of him could say it instead. He had stood in the kitchen doorway while Mrs. Yoon outlined the plan and said nothing, and the nothing had had a particular quality to it, dense and considered, the silence of a man running calculations. I'll have 2 men with you, he said finally. You won't see them, but they'll be there. I'm going to a cafe and a clinic, Ji-hoon said. Not a summit. I'm aware of what you're going to. His eyes moved to Ji-hoon's face and stayed there. Humor me. Ji-hoon had wanted to argue, on principle, because 3 years of having his movements monitored and controlled had left him with a specific and physical resistance to being watched. But Hyunwoo's surveillance felt different in a way he couldn't yet articulate, less like a cage and more like a perimeter. And so he had said fine and left it at that. The morning was cold and bright, the kind of Seoul autumn day that looked warm through glass and wasn't. Ji-hoon walked the 2 blocks to the cafe slowly, one hand in his coat pocket, the other resting at the curve of his belly, and felt the city around him with the particular attention of someone who had spent the last week inside. Noise. Exhaust. The smell of street food from a cart on the corner. Ordinary things, aggressively ordinary, and he was grateful for every one of them. He ordered at the counter and took the corner table and did not bring a book, because he was done pretending to read, and sat for 20 minutes watching the street outside. At some point he became aware of a man at a table near the door who had been there when he arrived and had not touched his coffee. Ji-hoon looked at him once, and the man looked at his phone. One of Hyunwoo's, almost certainly. The knowledge settled in his chest without distress. He finished his drink and left. The clinic was 10 minutes away on foot. He took the longer route because the morning was still beautiful, and because some part of him was not ready to go back inside anywhere. Not yet. And he was so absorbed in the clean, cold air and the simple physical fact of moving through the world that he didn't notice the car until it had slowed to match his pace. Black. No plates. Moving alongside him at walking speed with the particular patience of something that had been waiting. Ji-hoon kept walking. looked ahead. His heart rate had already changed, a quick, animal adjustment, the body making decisions before the mind caught up. He heard the door open behind him. He moved fast, faster than 9 months pregnant should have allowed, cutting left into a narrow passage between two buildings, his hand already pulling his phone from his pocket. He got 3 steps before a second man appeared at the far end of the passage, and the physics of the situation resolved themselves immediately and completely. He had time to unlock his phone. The screen showed Hyunwoo's name at the top of his recent calls, and he pressed it and had the phone to his ear before the first man reached him. And it rang once, and then the phone was gone, knocked from his hand, skittering across wet pavement, and an arm came across his shoulders from behind. Not violent, just absolute. The grip of someone who had done this before and knew that resistance at this stage was theater. "Don't," the man behind him said quietly. "We're not here to hurt you." "Let go of me," Ji-hoon said, and his voice was steadier than he expected it to be, steadier than he felt. "The car. That's all. Just the car." The second man had picked up his phone. He looked at the screen, Hyunwoo's name, the call still attempting to connect, and ended it. Pocketed it. Looked at Ji-hoon with the expression of someone completing a transaction. "Park Seo-jin sends his regards," he said. Ji-hoon said nothing. He filed the name away the way you file pain. Noted, recorded, dealt with later. Right now there was only the grip on his shoulders and the car at the end of the passage, and the calculation of whether resistance was possible or just costly. He looked at the man in front of him. "I'm 9 months pregnant. We know. If anything happens to this baby, nothing is going to happen to the baby." He said it with the flat efficiency of someone reciting a briefing. "Mr. Park wants the child delivered safely. You are being transported. That's all." The word transported landed like a door locking. They moved him to the car quickly and without drama, one man on each side, close enough that from the street it might have looked like assistance rather than seizure. The back seat was warm and smelled of cigarettes and something chemical underneath, and the door closed and the car moved and Ji-hoon sat very still in the middle of the seat and breathed and thought. Hyunwoo's name on the screen. One ring. The call cut. He would have seen the missed call. Whether the call had connected for even a second before the phone was taken, whether anything had come through, a breath, the ambient sound of the passage, the man's voice saying Park Seo-jin sends his regards. Ji-hoon didn't know. He pressed his hands flat against his belly and felt the baby, still moving, still steady, and focused on that because it was the only thing he could control. The drive was 40 minutes. He tracked it by feel, the direction of light through the tinted windows, the texture of the roads, the way the city sound changed and then thinned, and then became something more industrial, more empty. They were outside the city proper when the car finally stopped. A warehouse. Disused, by the look of it, metal walls, concrete floor, the specific cold of a space that hadn't been heated in years. They brought him inside and sat him on a chair that had been placed in the center of the floor with a deliberate staging of something that had been planned. And the two men withdrew to the edges of the room and stood and waited. Ji-hoon looked at the chair, at the room, at the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling casting a light that was more shadow than illumination. Then he felt it, a tightening across his abdomen that started at his back and moved forward in a slow, unmistakable wave. He pressed his lips together, breathed through it, checked the clock in his head against the last time he had felt something similar, and found the calculation alarming. He looked up at the man nearest the wall. "I need you to understand something," Ji-hoon said, very clearly and very calmly. "Whatever your instructions are, whatever he told you to do, you need to call someone right now." The man frowned. "You're fine. Mr. Park will arrive within." "I am not fine," Ji-hoon said. "I am in labor." The silence that followed had a different quality from every silence that had come before it. Both men looked at each other, then at Ji-hoon, with the specific expression of people whose plan had not included this variable and who were now doing rapid, inadequate math. Ji-hoon breathed through the second contraction and said nothing more. Somewhere across the city, a phone was ringing. Hyunwoo had known something was wrong before the call dropped. He had felt it the way he felt most things, not as intuition, which implied uncertainty, but as data. The missed call. The ambient second of sound before the line went dead. A voice in the background, male, professional, saying a name that Hyunwoo had been building a case against for 2 weeks. He had been on his feet before the phone left his ear, moving through the penthouse with the particular economy of a man who had been in emergencies so many times that the body had stopped treating them as extraordinary. He made 3 calls in the elevator. By the time he reached the underground car park, he had a location. The drive took 22 minutes. It should have taken 35. Ji-hoon had stopped counting contractions because the counting was making it worse. He focused instead on the concrete floor, on the precise pattern of cracks running from the chair leg outward, on breathing in the specific rhythm Mrs. Yoon had mentioned once in passing, as though she had known this moment was coming. The two men had moved from the walls to the center of the room, and were now standing 6 feet away looking at him with the expressions of people who had been trained for a number of contingencies and had not been trained for this one. One of them was on the phone. Ji-hoon could hear the low, urgent edge of the conversation without making out words. The other was doing nothing, which was somehow worse. "I need something to hold on to," Ji-hoon said through his teeth during a contraction. "The chair back. Turn the chair around." The nearer man moved the chair. Ji-hoon gripped the back of it and breathed and felt the wave crest and recede, and left his fingerprints in whatever cheap paint was left on the metal. The warehouse was cold. That was the thing he kept returning to, not the pain, which was enormous and undeniable but had a rhythm he could work with, but the cold, which was ambient and total and pressed against his skin from every direction. He was still in his coat, but the floor was concrete, and the walls were metal, and the single bare bulb overhead produced light without heat, and the baby was coming regardless of all of it. He heard the vehicles before the men did. 2 of them, by the sound, engines cutting out in quick succession, doors opening, and then nothing. No voices. No footsteps yet. Just the silence of people who had trained themselves to move quietly, and the specific quality of that silence, its discipline, its intention, told Ji-hoon everything before the warehouse door opened. When it did, it came off its hinges. Not explosively. Not with the drama of film. Just with the quiet, absolute force of men who had calculated the exact amount of pressure required and applied it without excess. 4 of them came through first, moving to the corners of the room with the geometric precision of people who had cleared spaces before and found it unremarkable. The 2 guards had their hands up before Ji-hoon had finished exhaling. Hyunwoo came through last. He walked into the warehouse the way he walked into every room. Without announcement, without urgency, except that tonight every line of him was different. The coat, the set of his jaw, the way his eyes moved across the room in one sweep and landed on Ji-hoon and stayed there. He crossed the floor in 8 steps and crouched in front of the chair and looked at Ji-hoon's face with an attention so complete it felt like being held. "Look at me," he said. "I am looking at you," Ji-hoon said. His voice came out rougher than intended. "Are you hurt?" "I'm in labor." Something moved across Hyunwoo's face, fast, tightly controlled, gone before it fully arrived. He reached out and took Ji-hoon's hand from the chair back and held it, and the warmth of it after the hours of cold was so immediate and so complete that Ji-hoon had to look at the ceiling for a moment to stay level. "The contractions," Hyunwoo said. "How far apart?" 4 minutes. Maybe 3 now." Hyunwoo stood and turned and said one word to the man nearest the door. The man was on a phone in seconds. Behind Hyunwoo, Ji-hoon could see the 2 guards being moved out of the warehouse efficiently and without ceremony, and he decided not to think too carefully about what efficiently meant in this context. "Can you walk?" Hyunwoo asked. "I don't know. We'll find out." He helped Ji-hoon up from the chair with the careful, total focus of a man who had decided that this and only this was what required his attention right now. Ji-hoon stood, gripped his forearm, and they moved. The hospital was private, and they were expected. Ji-hoon registered this distantly. The speed of the intake, the absence of waiting, the way staff moved with the brisk choreography of people who had been called ahead and briefed. And then the contractions took over completely, and the logistics of the world became someone else's problem. Hyunwoo stayed. Ji-hoon hadn't asked him to. Hadn't had the bandwidth to ask anything. But when the worst of it came, the hours that had no clean narrative, no dignity, only the enormous biological fact of a body doing what bodies do at the outer edge of what they can endure, Hyunwoo was there. Not hovering. Not talking. Just present, in the chair beside the bed, and when Ji-hoon reached sideways during one contraction and found his hand, Hyunwoo didn't move or speak, just held on with the same steadiness he brought to everything. The baby arrived at 4:17 in the morning. A boy. Small and furious and immediately, insistently alive, with a cry that filled the room and seemed to have opinions about everything. The nurse placed him on Ji-hoon's chest, and Ji-hoon looked down at him and felt something rearrange itself in the center of his chest in a way that was permanent and complete and required no words. He became aware, after a moment, that Hyunwoo had stood and was looking at the baby with an expression Ji-hoon had never seen on his face before. Not the controlled neutrality. Not the cold steadiness. Something unguarded, something that had gotten through before he could stop it, and he wasn't trying to stop it. "He's all right," Hyunwoo said quietly. "He's perfect," the nurse said. Ji-hoon looked up at Hyunwoo. At the man who had come through a warehouse door in the dark and crossed a cold floor and held his hand through 4 hours of the worst night of his life. He thought about 7 months of Thursdays. About the silence before he moved. "Thank you," Ji-hoon said. It came out barely above a whisper. Hyunwoo looked at him. His jaw worked once. Then he said, quietly and with the precision of a man choosing exactly the right words, "Don't thank me for that." Ji-hoon looked back down at his son. Outside the window, Seoul was beginning its gray, gradual move toward morning, the city waking up slowly, indifferently, the way it always did. But in this room, at 4:17, something had shifted in a way that the city didn't know about and couldn't account for. Nothing between them would be the same. They both knew it. Neither said it. They didn't need to. Before I tell you what happens next, subscribe to Starry-Eyed Lovers, and tell me where you're watching from. The bag was small. That was intentional. Ji-hoon had thought about it carefully, in the methodical way he had learned to think about things that were painful. Not avoiding the pain, but moving through it in an organized direction. A small bag meant he was being practical, not running. A small bag meant he had thought about what the baby actually needed versus what fear told him to take. 2 changes of clothes. The blanket Mrs. Yoon had bought without being asked, pale yellow, softer than anything Ji-hoon had owned in years. The documents folder Hyunwoo's lawyer had quietly prepared after the custody filing, which Ji-hoon was taking not because he planned to use it against anyone, but because it belonged to him, and he was done leaving things behind. He worked in the early morning, while the baby slept in the bassinet beside the bed, while the penthouse held its particular pre-dawn silence. He moved carefully, with the unhurried focus of someone who had made a decision and was now simply executing it, and he did not let himself look at the bassinet more than necessary, because every time he did his resolve did something complicated, and he needed it uncomplicated right now. He had written the note 3 times before he was satisfied with it. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because every version kept becoming something it wasn't supposed to be. The first draft was too explanatory. The second was too cold. The third said only what was true and nothing more. This is not about fear. You know what it's about. Thank you for everything you are. Ji-hoon. He folded it and left it on the kitchen counter, where Mrs. Yoon would find it first and Hyunwoo would find it second, which felt right, which felt like giving him a moment before the knowing. He was at the elevator with the bag on his shoulder and the baby strapped against his chest when he heard the study door open behind him. He closed his eyes briefly. Open them. The elevator takes 40 seconds, Hyunwoo said, from somewhere behind him. You've been standing there for longer than that. Ji-hoon pressed the call button. Go back to bed. I don't sleep. Footsteps, unhurried. You know that. Ji-hoon kept his eyes on the elevator doors. The baby stirred against his chest, a small, restless movement, and he pressed his palm flat to the tiny back and felt the breathing steady again. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I'm not making it anything, Hyunwoo said. I'm standing in my hallway. Hyunwoo. Ji-hoon. He turned around then because the tone required it. Not commanding, not cold, just his name said in a particular way that he hadn't learned to ignore yet. Hyunwoo was standing 10 feet away in the half-dark of the corridor, still dressed, and Ji-hoon wondered distantly if he had slept at all, or if he had simply been waiting in the study with the particular patience of a man who had learned that most things revealed themselves if you gave them enough time. He won't stop, Ji-hoon said. Seojin. The warehouse was a message. The next thing will be worse, and the thing after that will be worse than that, and every single one of them will land here, in your building, on your people, because of me. He kept his voice level. You built something. I'm not going to be the thing that unmakes it. Hyunwoo looked at him steadily. That's my decision to make. Not when it costs you things it shouldn't. What it costs me, Hyunwoo said quietly, is also my decision. Ji-hoon shifted the bag on his shoulder. The baby made a small sound and settled. You came through a warehouse door for me. You held my hand for 4 hours. You have not once made me feel like a problem to be managed, and I need you to understand that is not a small thing. That is not something I take lightly. His throat tightened and he pushed through it. Which is exactly why I have to go. That logic, Hyunwoo said, only works if I want you to. Ji-hoon stared at him. Leave, I mean. He hadn't moved from his place in the corridor. It only works if you leaving resolves something for me. If the calculation on my side is neutral. He paused. It isn't. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. The doors opened. Warm light mirrored walls, the quiet mechanical patience of a machine that didn't care either way. Ji-hoon didn't move. He has a city councilor and 2 prosecutors, Ji-hoon said. You know that. Your own people told you that. Yes. He will come at you through every legitimate channel available before he tries the next warehouse. I know. And you're still, Jihoon stopped. Pressed his lips together. You're still standing there telling me the calculation isn't neutral. Yes, Hyunwoo said. Simply. Finally. Like a door opening rather than closing. Jihoon looked at the elevator. At the mirrored walls showing a version of him he barely recognized. A small bag, a baby on his chest, standing at the threshold of a choice in the half-dark of a corridor in a city that owed him nothing. He looked like someone in the middle of something. He looked like someone who had not yet decided whether they were at the beginning or the end. He looked back at Hyunwoo. I don't know how to let someone do this, he said quietly. I don't know how to stand still and let someone put themselves between me and the thing coming. Every instinct I have says move. Every instinct I have says that staying is how you become a liability, a weakness, a handle someone uses to get to the person protecting you. His voice dropped. I have been used as a handle before. Something in Hyunwoo's face shifted. Not the unguarded expression from the hospital, not something that arrived and left before it was fully seen, but something slower and more deliberate. The expression of a man choosing to be known rather than simply revealing himself by accident. I know, he said. I read the file, remember. He took 3 steps forward, closing the distance to something that required acknowledgement, and looked at Ji-hoon with the direct, unhurried attention that had unnerved him in the park and now felt like the steadiest thing in the room. You are not a handle. You are not a liability. And the instinct you're describing, the one telling you to move, to protect everyone by disappearing, that instinct was built in a place that deserved to be burned down. Ji-hoon's breath caught. Stay, Hyunwoo said. Not a command. Not a plea. Something in between, something that had weight because it came from a man who asked for very little and meant everything he said. Let me handle what's coming. Not because you can't, because you don't have to. The elevator doors closed. Neither of them had moved toward them. Ji-hoon stood in the corridor with the bag on his shoulder and his son breathing against his chest, and felt the particular vertigo of a person standing at the exact moment their oldest survival strategy stops making sense. The instinct was still there. Move, disappear, protect everyone by removing yourself from the equation. It was loud and familiar, and had kept him alive through things he didn't talk about. But Hyunwoo was standing 10 feet away, steady and unmistakable. And the look on his face was the same look it had been at 4:17 in the morning when the baby cried for the first time, and something had gotten through before he could stop it. Ji-hoon slid the bag off his shoulder. He didn't say anything. There wasn't a version of it that wouldn't sound like too much or too little. He just stood there with the bag at his feet and his son against his chest, and let that be the answer. Hyunwoo looked at the bag on the floor, then at Ji-hoon, and said nothing, because nothing was what was needed, and he always seemed to know exactly what was needed. He turned and walked back to the study. Ji-hoon picked up the bag and carried it back to his room. 3 weeks after the warehouse, Park Seo-jin's lead prosecutor withdrew from the custody case. No reason was given publicly. Ji-hoon read the notification on his phone while feeding the baby at 6 in the morning and sat with it for a long moment, turning it over the way you turn over something that looks like good news, but arrived too quietly to trust entirely. He showed it to Hyunwoo at breakfast. Hyunwoo read it, set the phone down, and resumed his coffee without comment, which told Ji-hoon everything he needed to know about how the withdrawal had happened. He didn't ask. He was learning the grammar of this, what to let sit, what to press, where the silences were load-bearing. The baby had been named Seo. Ji-hoon had decided this alone, in the hospital, in the gray hour before Hyunwoo returned with coffee, and Mrs. Yoon arrived with a bag of things no one had asked her to bring, but all of which were exactly necessary. He had written the name on the form and only told Hyunwoo afterward, half expecting a reaction, getting instead a stillness that was somehow better than any response he could have anticipated. COO, Hyunwoo had said, trying the sound of it. Yes, Ji-hoon had said, watching his face. Hyunwoo had nodded once, slowly, and looked at the baby in the bassinet with an expression that had no armor in it at all. It was Mrs. Yoon who told him, on a Tuesday afternoon 3 days after the prosecutor withdrew. She appeared in the doorway of the guest room. Ji-hoon still thought of it as the guest room, had not yet given himself permission to think of it any other way, and said, with her usual absence of preamble, that Mr. Seo had left the building that morning and had not said when he would return, and that there had been a phone call before he left that Mrs. Yoon described only as difficult, and that Ji-hoon might want to know this. Ji-hoon looked at her. Where did he go? He didn't say. Did anyone go with him? A pause that was its own answer. No. Jihoon was in the elevator 4 minutes later with COO in the carrier against his chest, because the baby went where he went now, because separation still felt theoretical. He had no plan. He had an address, the cafe in See a Demon, the one Hyunwoo had mentioned, the one that had Thursdays in it and a corner table and a book that never got read. And he had the particular certainty of someone who has stopped arguing with what they know. The cafe was small and warm and smelled of roasted barley and old wood. Jihoon stood inside the door and let his eyes adjust and found Hyunwoo immediately, because Hyunwoo in a room was not something you had to search for. Corner table. No book. A cup he hadn't touched. Staring at the street outside with the expression of a man conducting an argument with himself and not winning. Jihoon crossed the cafe and sat down across from him. Hyunwoo looked up. Something moved across his face, surprise almost, which on him was barely a flicker, but was more than Jihoon had ever seen before. How did you know? He said. Mrs. Yoon. Of course. He looked at COO, then at Jihoon. You should be resting. You should be answering your phone, Jihoon said. What was the call this morning? Hyunwoo was quiet for a moment. Outside, a delivery truck rattled past the window, and the cafe settled back into its quiet. Seojin is changing strategy, he said finally. The legal route is closing down, which means the next move is personal. He paused. He made certain implications about what personal means. Jihoon held his gaze. About me. About you. About COO. The name came out carefully, the way it always did from Hyunwoo, like something handled with both hands. About what it costs a man like me to be seen protecting something. And you came here. I needed to think. You came to the place you used to come to think about me, Jihoon said. To think about what it costs you to keep me. He said it plainly, without accusation, because it wasn't an accusation. It was just the sentence, and they were past the point where prettying it up served either of them. Hyunwoo looked at him across the table. The morning light came through the cafe window at a low angle and fell across his face, and he looked, Jihoon thought, tired in a way he never allowed himself to look in the penthouse. Human in a way that the architecture of his daily life didn't make room for. I'm not leaving, Jihoon said. I'm not asking you to. Then what are you doing? The silence stretched. Hyunwoo looked at his untouched cup. At the table. At Jihoon. I'm trying, he said quietly, to decide whether what I want to do is something I have the right to do. Jihoon felt the sentence settle over him, felt its precise weight. What do you want to do? Hyunwoo looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, low and without any of the architecture around it, stripped of everything except the fact of it. Keep you. Both of you. Permanently. Not as protection, not as obligation. A pause. As mine. The word landed differently from how Jihoon had expected. Not possessive in the way he had been trained to flinch from. Not the hard-edged territorial claiming of a man who needed to own things to feel safe. Something older than that. Something that sounded, underneath the economy of it, almost like a question. The scent bond, Jihoon said carefully. You've never pushed that. No. Why? Because it requires your choice, Hyunwoo said. Completely and without pressure. And you have been in this situation long enough that I was not willing to trust my own judgment about what counted as pressure. Jihoon looked at him. At the man who had come through a warehouse door and held his hand for 4 hours and stood in a corridor at 2 a.m. and talked him out of disappearing and had spent 7 months in this exact cafe saying nothing because the rules required it. Who was sitting here now not in the penthouse, not behind the desk, not inside any of the structures that made him legible as the most powerful man in the room, but in a corner table in a small cafe with an untouched cup and a question he was waiting to have answered. Jihoon reached across the table. He placed his hand over Hyunwoo's and felt the stillness move through him. That particular absolute stillness, except that this time it wasn't control, it was something else entirely, something that had been waiting a long time to be permitted. Yes, Jihoon said. Hyunwoo turned his hand over beneath Jihoon's and held it. Outside the cafe, Seoul continued at its enormous indifferent pace. Inside, COO made a small sound against Jihoon's chest, a soft exhale, completely unbothered. Jihoon looked down at him, and then back up at Hyunwoo, who was looking at them both with that unguarded expression that had no armor in it, the one that had first appeared at 4:17 in the morning and had been appearing more frequently since, as if the armor had developed a leak it could no longer locate. Ours, Jihoon said quietly. Not a question. Ours, Hyunwoo said. Always. The lights went out at 11:43. Not gradually, not with the flicker that precedes a power failure. All at once, completely, the penthouse dropping from its usual low, warm illumination into a darkness so total it had texture. Jihoon was in the bedroom feeding Seo when it happened, and he went still immediately, the instinct preceding the thought, his hand pressing flat against the baby's back before he had consciously decided to move. Then Hyunwoo's voice came through the darkness from the doorway, quiet and entirely without alarm. Stay in this room. Do not open the door for anyone except Mrs. Yoon or me. What's happening? The building's external power was cut. Floors 12 through 30 are still on the generator. We are not. A pause. That was intentional. Jihoon heard him move. Not toward the bedroom but away from it, back into the penthouse, and the quality of his footsteps had changed, shed something, become the footsteps of a different version of the same man. Hyunwoo. He kept his voice low. How many? A silence. Then, enough to think it would matter. The door closed. Jihoon sat in the dark with COO and thought carefully and quickly the way the last 3 months had taught him to think. Not around fear but through it, using it as information rather than weather. Seojin had been building to this. The legal withdrawal had not been defeat, it had been consolidation, resources redirected from legitimate channels into something that couldn't be appealed or adjourned or withdrawn at the last minute by a prosecutor whose case had suddenly become inconvenient. He had come himself this time. Jihoon was certain of that without being told. This was too personal for delegation. COO had gone quiet against his chest with the uncanny perception of very young things, as though he understood that silence was currently load-bearing. Jihoon held him and moved to the wall beside the window, not in front of it, beside it, and looked out at the slice of city visible from this angle. 3 black vehicles in the loading bay below. A 4th blocking the street exit. Not subtle. Not designed to be. The bedroom door opened. Mrs. Yoon. A thin flashlight in one hand, a phone in the other, her face holding the specific composure of someone who had been through worse than this and found it manageable. She closed the door behind her and crossed to Jihoon without a word and took COO from him with the practiced authority of a woman who had decided she was holding the baby now. Mr. CO says the east stairwell, she said quietly. When I tell you, I'm not leaving without him. You're not being asked to leave the building, she said. You're being asked to not be in this room. She looked at him steadily. There's a difference. In the main corridor, Hyunwoo moved through his own penthouse the way he moved through every difficult space, with the cold, navigational clarity of a man who had mapped every exit before he ever needed one. He had 4 men with him. He had wanted 6, but 6 would have taken another 4 minutes, and 4 minutes was longer than they had. He heard them breach the stairwell door at the far end of the corridor. Not the east stairwell, the west, the one he would have used if he were coming from below with men who didn't know the floor plan well enough to know that the west stairwell deposited you 10 meters from the primary corridor with no cover on either side. They didn't know the floor plan. He did. The first 2 came through the door in the posture of men who had been told this would be straightforward, and found immediately that it was not. Hyunwoo's people were already at the angles, and the corridor resolved itself in under 90 seconds in the specific, efficient language of people who had trained for this, and people who had been told they wouldn't need to. Then Seojin stepped through the door. He was not what the situation called for. He was dressed too well, his coat too clean, his hands empty in a way that announced he had brought other hands for the work. He was 52 years old, and he looked it, and he looked also like a man who had spent his entire adult life in rooms where his presence alone constituted a threat, and was only now encountering the specific disorientation of a room where it didn't. He looked at Hyunwoo across the corridor. You should have stayed out of this, Seojin said. His voice was steady. Jihoon had been right about that much. He was not a man who rattled easily. This is a private matter. It stopped being private, Hyunwoo said, the night you put him on the street. He's an Omega. He's mine by registration. The bond is still legally. The bond was dissolved, Hyunwoo said. 4 days ago. You were notified this morning. Something moved across Seojin's face. A recalculation. You think paper changes what is. I think you came here with 12 men and a cut power line, Hyunwoo said. And you are now standing in my corridor with 4 of those men no longer standing, and I need you to update your assessment of how this ends. Seojin looked at the corridor, at the geometry of the situation, which had resolved entirely against him. His jaw tightened. The child is mine biologically. The child's name is COO, Hyunwoo said, and his voice dropped to something quiet and absolute, the register he used when the conversation was ending rather than continuing. He carries that name because his parent chose it. He will grow up in this building, with his parent, under my protection. You will not come here again. You will not file again. You will not send anyone here again. He paused. Because the next conversation we have will not be in a corridor. Seojin stared at him. The calculation was visible, for once, on the surface of his face. The assessment of a man who had never lost anything he had decided to keep, running the numbers on a situation that had stopped adding up in his favor somewhere around the second stairwell. You don't know what you're taking on, Seojin said. I know exactly what I'm taking on, Hyunwoo said. I chose it. Jihoon heard the stairwell door open and close. Heard the specific quality of silence that followed. Not the silence of things unresolved, but of things concluded. He was in the east corridor with Mrs. Yoon and COO and the thin beam of a flashlight when Hyunwoo appeared at the far end of it, and the darkness made it impossible to read his face until he was close, and then it was readable and everything in it was intact. It's over, Hyunwoo said. Jihoon looked at him. Is he? Gone. He won't come back. Jihoon nodded. He believed it not because he was told to but because of the specific certainty with which Hyunwoo said it, the flatness of it, the absence of any qualifier. Mrs. Yoon transferred COO back to Jihoon's arms with the brisk efficiency of a task completed and walked back toward the kitchen, as if power cuts and corridor confrontations were administrative inconveniences she intended to have sorted before morning. The emergency lights came on, dim and amber, casting the corridor in something warmer than darkness. Jihoon looked at Hyunwoo. At the man who had come through a warehouse and a custody battle and 12 men in a corridor, and was standing here now in the amber half-light looking at Jihoon and COO with the expression that had no armor in it, the one that had become, over weeks, the truest thing Jihoon knew about him. Come here, Jihoon said quietly. Hyunwoo crossed the corridor and stood close, and Jihoon leaned into him without ceremony, without the architecture of deciding, just leaned, and Hyunwoo's arm came around them both, Jihoon and COO together, steady and unhurried and permanent. Outside, Seoul blazed on, indifferent and enormous and entirely unaware. Inside, in the amber light, everything they had built held.